when the South African government ratified, put into constitution what they call expropriation of land without compensation. It now meant that the government in South Africa can take land when it's needed for public use, when it's needed for other things that the state deems necessary to take the country forward. And so what is the context around that legislation? Well, the context is South Africa comes from an apartheid era where black people were dispossessed of their land, where black people were moved around into, in fact, the not so desirable places. In addition to that, the apartheid government built what we call townships. In other countries, they are called slums, or I think the US called them the hood or something of that sort. But basically, a place where mostly poor would stay and therefore has less services that you would find in the suburbs, has no development that you would find in the suburb. It's not as greenfield like you would find in the suburbs. And so when they built these townships across the country, it was a way to contain black people that were moving around from all sorts of spaces. In some cases, one of the famous towns here in South Africa was a multiracial town called Sophia Town in Gauteng, where all races were mixing, and the then apartheid government instituted laws that black people and other races are not allowed to intermarry, nor stay together, nor mingle, and so on. So they came up with all sorts of laws, including the Group Areas Act, where its sole purpose was to break this thing of a rainbow nation, as we call it today. And the real story behind it was just to put an end to the possibility of South Africa becoming a true multiracial nation. In what sense? Where a black person is married to a white person, etc., etc., etc. And so for apartheid gains and reasons, they separated the people. So today, what is famously known as Soweto is actually an apartheid construct. There was no Soweto before. These things were built as migrant areas or migrant labor areas or prison cells, if you may say. So when they were building these things in the days of apartheid, because Joburg was exploding due to mining discovery or gold deposit discovery in Joburg, there was a lot of mines and there was a lot of need for cheap black labor. So many of the people around that time were moving around from rural areas into the cities. And so a lot of the places that were built were not just for apartheid reason for the sake of let's move black people here, keep white people here. Many of them had to do with we need cheap labor, we need people to go work in the mines, and so on and so on. So what is a glorious Soweto today, the history behind is not glorious. The logic and the intention behind was not glorious. So there was a lot of land dispossession as early as the 1900s. And I mean, as we have people who are able to show today to the government that as early as the early 1900s, they have papers that their forefathers were dispossessed of land. So enter the era of democracy now. The ANC government, the majority ruling party, says we need to come up with legislation that's going to redress, and redress here is to correct the apartheid errors, to correct the evils of apartheid. Now, some of the laws have been around for the longest time. I mean, for 30 years since the ANC came in. And a lot of the redress has not happened at the pace that would make South Africa a country really to be envied by many. And what does that mean? Enter the crime issue. Because the apartheid correction or the ills and the evils of apartheid correction didn't happen in time or as they should be, you have a country where 30 years or 35 years down the line, that even though it's black majority ruled and the natives are the black majority, you still have a mirror of apartheid where the blacks were mostly, the poor were mostly, the dispossessed and so on. 30 years down the line, that has not been fully addressed. So what that has caused is that it led to high unemployment and by design, crime. So South Africa then begins to suffer a lot of crime, especially violent crime, right? and it becomes headlines wherever you go. South Africa is a violent country, whatever. But this is the context behind it, that there is a lot of poverty which could have been addressed if the apartheid ills were sorted. I mean, for example, the fact that Soweto and many other townships were designed as cheap migrant hostels, and the hostel there mean a dwelling place for cheap labor. If these things were addressed, one wonders if Soweto would exist, or it would exist in a different shape and other townships than we know them to be, right? They would have been completely redesigned to meet the standard of human dignity. So a lot of these things didn't happen at a pace fast enough to address the backlog of many poor. And over the 30 years that the ANC has been in power, keep in mind the global economy continued to steam ahead. So you had the 2008 global financial crisis, and those things exacerbated the poverty. You had the recent pandemic, those things exacerbated the poverty. So what it meant is that black people in the majority kept on climbing into the cycles of unemployment. And every time that happens, you have a problem of crime. Then you have another issue, which one of the delegation with President Ramaphosa mentioned it, that we also have an illegal immigrant crisis. So the cause behind it is that some of the neighboring countries surrounding South Africa have their own social ills, have their own economic ills. And so those people come into the country looking for better opportunities. And most of the time, they are the poor, therefore they won't have the means, etc., to be able to come in and do it the legal way. So a lot of them come illegally, which poses more problems for the country. So you have a country where there is apartheid overhang of economic inequality. Remember, during apartheid, what the apartheid government did, they reserved certain jobs only for whites. And to this day, even though apartheid has been gone by 30 years plus, you still have certain career fields where there's few black people there, because the system was designed to keep them out. And in addition to that, the education was of such quality that you're not going to have a lot of black engineers, black scientists, etc., because the education system during apartheid was not great. Now, enter the ANC government, who is supposed to move at lightning speed to correct a poor education system and all those things that are meant to keep black people out. Some of the legislation the government came up with was to say, okay, what we need to do in every sector of the economy, we need to have black representation, which I think in the US was called DEI. The black representation in the US and in SA, even though in terms of concept they sound the same, they are not the same here in South Africa, because in South Africa, we are trying to address what apartheid did to the black majority, so that there is equality between the white population and the black population. In fact, the intent of the government was never to make black people superior over the whites. It was just to say, let us be equal. And when the legislation was crafted, in majority of the times, it would be crafted in this manner, that every sector must reflect the population balance. So the population balance in South Africa is that it's 80% black, 9% white, and then I think 7% Asian, etc. So wherever you look in the country, everything must reflect that. Now, what happened is, especially in the economy, even though that is an outcome the government was gearing for, you had an issue where when the democratic government came in, the economic sector said, well, we hear you, but your people don't have the skills. So you had a huge gap, and this was by design, that the people shouldn't have the skills. And this was by design, that the people should not be in the commanding heights of the economy. So what that meant is the government now has, however many years, time that they need to correct that you have fewer black engineers, you have fewer black attorneys, etc. Every other sector that you can think of the economy, and do something by equipping the black majority and getting them through. You also had bottlenecks in the way the apartheid system was designed. It was not designed to encapsulate or be able to draw in and be able to capture 80% of the population now coming in to say, okay, we want to be lawyers, we want to be doctors, we want to be etc. The universities themselves were far too few to even handle it. The schooling system itself would have to be completely redesigned. Completely. And the government had to, they came up with all sorts of things. We have what we call SETAs in South Africa, where every economic sector has a functionary from government that looks at the sector in terms of transformation. And when we talk about transformation, we are talking about the fact that how many black people are there in that sector. And if it's majority white, doesn't reflect the population, needs to be corrected. So the so-called SETAs are there to help those sectors to redress the error.